We have in the reading from the Acts of the Apostles on this day an interesting combination of things. We find that there is a place where prayer is accustomed to happen. We might have a place where a word has come before, a grace has passed. One goes into a chapel, a church, where we have been with the Lord before, and where He has ministered to our soul personally. There are memories of past graces in the air. It is good to have a place to which one can return, for one lives again those graces just like that. There are points of earth that are privileged points and really belong to heaven and are extra-territorial. Their geography is not quite the same. I recall way back at the age of 13, there was a place which had a fascination, and the fact that the doors were always open was not indifferent either. It was the Catholic Church in Llandrumney, in one of the suburbs of Cardiff, where we lived at the time, and there was something there. We need to be aware of that. A church where the presence is not like any other building. And the very fact of having that place open gives the Lord of Lords the possibility of Himself being the interior master. And He, in His providence, can send a soul to that quiet place. We must remember that before we lock a church. I recall information in France, at La Trappe, how we were taught to receive the word. It was the monastic custom of having those virgin moments before dawn orientated towards listening. First of all, there was, after vigils sung in church, half an hour of silence in church. There was only a very dim light way up in the high ceiling of the church. Therefore, there wasn't a loud light to distract, and the focus was on the invisible and the interior and the presence. The little light, the lamp beside the tabernacle at the far end of the church was enough. And so, for that half hour, already there would be a reception, an intake, a passivity, a waiting, an abdication, a handing over. And as Teresa of Avila points out, there is a great advantage in mental prayer, because, different from the execution of external prayer, it presumes one thing, the handing on of the will, and therefore there can be less illusion, for one meets the guest in silence, and one doesn't push him away by serving him with the externals. Having said that, the externals create an atmosphere also where that can be sustained. but it needs to happen in such a way that it does that and not draw attention to itself. But we were taught then, with regard to the quiet moments between then and Lord's, that there is the ancient discipline found throughout the monastic centuries of Lectio Divina. And in the Cistercian tradition, the usage was to begin it on one's knees, with a strong invocation of the Holy Spirit, and the first verses being read still on one's knees. And it was explained to us that it is the same as the invocation of the Spirit at Holy Mass, when the priest extends his hands over the gifts at the epiclesis and impetrates the coming and the power and the blessing and the action of the Holy Spirit. So too we implore that the Spirit will hover again over the depths and make the Word ignite for us. And it is enough then to take what is sufficient for a launching. It is not a head knowledge, but a heart knowledge. And when the heart is warmed, as on the road of Emmaus, did not our hearts burn within us as He opened unto us the Scriptures? So we can go into flight at a word which warms us. Years ago, I happened to be reading this very passage, and I was quite struck by this one verse. I had been given a German Bible, and I was reading it actually in German, and the words, the translation actually by Martin Luther, are very strong on this verse. Den Worten aufmerksam lauschte. She paid a completely open attention, a marked listening, a complete heed to the words spoken by the Apostle Paul. And the Greek has these words in which, in the same verse, twice over, there is an emphasis on the opening. Es o Kyrios di inixen din kardian, whose heart the Lord now completely opened. It's not just opened, but completely opened. The dia is in there. The heart. Now, here we are again. Prosechen. Tis la lumenis apo tu Pavlu. Prosechen is to give attention. Pros, unto. So one is completely available unto. And the power in the word is not having any obstacle to get inside us. But how often does it happen? I recall how in student days way back in Aberystwyth, I was impressed by the way that my evangelical friends on a Saturday evening would flock to a teaching. They would get a great speaker to come, and it was an event. The word was awaited and then discussed. It was cultivated. The word has power. I remember actually one time, fairly early on, drifting into one teaching on prayer, because I thought that would be interesting. And I noticed only later that he had spoken non-stop for 2 hours, but it only seemed half an hour. Why? He was just so interesting and alive And I thought to myself, it's not a question of time at all, chronologically. It's a question of interest. One can be boring in 5 minutes. And so, two things, content and delivery. The word does not have to be a penance. And I recall how in Wales, before the invention of anything modern like television, the word was hugely celebrated and awaited. The great preacher coming to town was a big event. And I remember still how in big events of this nature, sometimes there was a double sermon, that is, two preachers in one big, long celebration of the word. That might be imbalanced. One can't take two sermons in one celebration easily. One needs the optimum, not the maximum, to have the effect. And also, one doesn't have to be always the same length. And that's a fault, perhaps, sometimes in that kind of setting. One is expected to speak a long time. And I've seen that also in Italy as well, that bishops sometimes are inclined to expect that they have to speak a lot. They don't. We need to know when we've reached the culmination and then stop and leave it in all its power echoing in the air. Not being able to stop is unfortunately counterproductive. We call them a person having landing difficulties. I recall how, as a child, the word, of course, being the only thing in the air essentially for us, even though celebrations could be long, they were at least now and could be an hour and a quarter, there were nevertheless consolations even for a child. And I remember two especially would switch even a child on. One was to see when a great preacher was starting to warm. You could see it coming. You'd be saying to yourself, we have ignition. And then he would really heat up. And you'd say to yourself, we have liftoff. And on and off he would go into mode, what we used to call hoil, sail. And it was an interesting experience because all the potentialities of man were exploited. Body and mind, and in it the soul passing and captivating the attention. How different from a read sermon, hardly different from a lecture. One cannot communicate oneself when the eyes are not communicating and touching. And the other was when I could see that the congregation itself was also taking off. Some hymns especially those towards the end of the day, the Lord's Day on Sunday, the great hymns at the end, you could see the great organist. We had actually great organists there, like Arwell Hughes. After a while you'd see him doing something at the organ. He'd be pulling out stops, more stops, and the congregation would repeat and go into 4-part harmony automatically, and the whole huge chapel would vibrate. Now that created an atmosphere certainly where through the emotions being opened, the will also could be touched. Why? It was a divine gift shared by man and angel. Harmony, beauty, sent back to the author of beauty in praise, in which also man was being healed. Why? It's the sound of home. And that helps us to understand how, if we only knew, God and man work together in the creation of both praise for him and consolation for man. We have a right to beauty. We have a right to what wakes us up and turns us on. We need to learn the trick of using what he's given us, beauty and power. I have heard oft a sound and heard it not, looked at a gaze and tapped not what was said. I have seen in an eye a thought forgot too soon, for 'twas too quickly hither shed. I have heard many things that shall remain unheard again, for I was unaware of all that moved therein, and mutterings plain will pass to whence they came, for none was there. None there, I say, none was at home to be a host to but a presence. None stood still to hold or catch a being, or to see what warmed and waited for a guarded chill. I have not listened well, but heard too much stray sound that found no ear whereto might touch.